was on the streets of London, 11,000 miles from Melbourne, that the battle for the Herald and Weekly Times was won. In smashing the power of the British print unions, Rupert Murdoch secured the funds for further conquest.
Forging success in the fires of discontent. Thanks for joining me. Rupert Murdoch is our feature story tonight, but the lead and the comics are devoted to another power broker.
You are being watched around the world because this is the launching today of a very big campaign that will go from one end of Australia to the other. We believe we know and are sure that we'll have a massive win at the elections on Saturday night.
Well, as the whole world now knows, Sir Joh's massive victory failed to materialise. Even in Queensland, 17% of the vote is only half a majority. And in the Territory, it wasn't enough to win the Nationals a single seat. So Sir Joh is very much a laughingstock in some circles tonight, as you'll see later in the program when we cross to the International Comedy Festival just getting underway in Melbourne. But wiser heads are wary of poking fun. And I suspect that includes Labor Premier Brian Burke over in Perth. Well, Mr Burke, thanks very much for joining us. Is it premature to reject Sir Joh at this stage?
I think it's absolutely premature. It's my view that he remains the biggest single threat to the persistence of the Labor Party in government that we've yet confronted. So this 17% in the Territory result notwithstanding, you believe the federal polls, do you? I certainly think that the Northern Territory result can't easily be translated into the federal arena, and it's clear to me that there is a big proportion of the Australian voting population who will accept at least part of what Sir Joh stands for. Why does he have this appeal? What's he got over them? I think he's able to present in a very simple form the prejudices of many Australians. I think he's able to explain away in the worst populist method, or by the worst populist method, the difficulties that people face and the way in which they might easily be able to solve some of those problems. Well, is federal Labor doing enough to counter him? I think that up until the last week or two, the Federal Labor Party has underestimated the dangers posed by Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen, and I think there has been an enticing tendency to wallow in the discomfort of John Howard and Ian Sinclair, and to somehow or other believe that that discomfort means that the Labor Party's political fortunes are being bolstered as a result of the dissent that's been provoked by Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen. That's not the case. I have always believed that the Conservative parties maximise their vote when there is a viable third party, when they accumulate votes as a result of that viable third party's activities. And that's what we're seeing emerge through the Sir Joh for PM push. Why has that message apparently been lost in Canberra if it's been clear to you? Because I think the first and easiest recognised result of Sir Joh's activities is the discomfort that John Howard finds himself in and that Ian Sinclair finds himself in. Now, for any practising politician, to see your opponent in an embarrassing situation is to contemplate a pleasant sight. And I suppose that is the first and easiest grasped upon result of Sir Joh's push. The second and much more dangerous thing for the Labor Party is to accept that if Sir Joh is able to attract only 2 or 3% of the traditional Labor Party vote at a federal election and then translate that to the Conservative Party's ledger, then that will secure the defeat of the Hawke government. OK, so you think the Hawke government is now belatedly seeing these warning signs. What should it do? Well, I think there are obvious weaknesses in Sir Joh's position. Firstly, let me say that I don't think he can be discounted simply by labelling him an absurd and laughable old man. And that's the tendency, but it won't work. I think there are weaknesses in Sir Joh's position that can be properly exploited, and those weaknesses start off with the fact that he will be 80 years of age if and when he ever completes his first term as Prime Minister. Secondly, his policies, ill-defined as they presently are, pose the prospect of a $19 billion deficit, and that deficit has to be funded. I think it's also true to say that if we're to talk about funding his deficit, we have to translate the 28% reduction in expenditure that it will cause to come about into the sorts of services that people demand, enjoy and need. when we can successfully convince people that that's what Sir Joh stands for and that's what his policies will cause in terms of their own lives, then we'll start to counter him successfully.
As you said, the immediate impact of Sir Joh has tended to be a disruption on the coalition side of things. Should Federal Labor be moving to capitalise on that? Should they be trying to go to an early poll?
I've always said that the Australia card is an issue of sufficient importance to impress upon the public that it could be an election issue and that it should not therefore be out of the question that there would not be a double dissolution and an early poll. But I wouldn't say on the basis of Sir Joh's push that an early election would be something the public would take kindly to.
But it's something that you think Federal Labor should at least be thinking seriously about?
I wouldn't rule out the option, Andrew. As far as I'm concerned, the national government has a responsibility to win the next election, and whether that means the election is 3, 4 or 5 months earlier than normal, I think is besides the point.
Of course, the federal government, the Federal Labor government, has got its own problems anyway. Your fellow West Australian, Senator Walsh, only gives them a 50-50 chance of being re-elected. What's your estimate?
Well, I would say that at best, the chances of re-election are 50-50. And remember that this government will be going into an election on the back of a budget that is the least like a pre-election budget that has ever been witnessed in this country.
Are you talking about the mini-budget coming up? Or?
Well, I'm talking about not only the mini-budget, but the budget proper that will follow the mini-budget. Now, regardless of how we try to bring forward the unpleasant medicine that might be included in the budget proper, normally, to the mini-budget time, it's still going to be a very difficult budget process on which to vault to electoral success. But I don't think that that's necessarily a weakness. If we can convince the public that what we are doing is sacrificing in a profitable way some of our present conveniences and standards for what in the mid to long term will be a much better standard and a much better Australia, then I think the public will accept that message and might well vote back the Hawke government.
You're really saying, though, that things are so bad that even if they have the heart, they can't put off a bad budget at the end of the year in August by simply having a very tough mini-budget, because they're still going to have a very tough budget at the major budget at the end of the year.
Look, I'm under no illusion as to the continuing difficulty that the federal government confronts, and people have not given it the credit that it's due for the actions that it has already taken in trying to straighten out an economic situation that it inherited and which was subsequently amplified by the international decline in the terms of trade affecting our products. Now, I believe that the difficulty is not going to be solved by a stiff mini-budget in May. It is going to be addressed on a continuing basis for the next 4 or 5 years. But that can be a strength rather than a weakness, provided we are able to say to the public, we are not, in terms of short-term political expediency, prepared to sacrifice the necessary steps that will restore economic health.
Of course, Mr Keating is calling on you and the other states to carry your share of the burden too. There's a Premier's Conference coming up and he wants you all to take big cuts. Will you cooperate?
There's no doubt that we'll cooperate. The only thing that we'll seek is a fair sharing of the burden, and on that basis then we'll certainly bear the expenditure reductions that are appropriately ours.
That's usually the sticking point, though. Who says what's a fair share?
Well, when I say a fair share, I don't mean a fair share in our terms. I mean a fair share one state as to the other, and a fair share when you compare the cutbacks imposed on the states with those endured by the Commonwealth. So I don't think we'll have a difficulty in arriving at a solution that might be painful for the states as well, but in arriving at a solution that complies with the economic policy being pursued by the national government.
You haven't always conceded the federal government's aims in the past, though. I mean, gold tax for one, rural assistance to farmers.
No, that's true. In areas where I've believed that the federal government has made wrong decisions, the gold tax is one of those. Aboriginal land rights was another where I thought the federal government was wrong-headed. In those areas, I've been prepared to contest the decisions. But at the same time, I'm not prepared to say that the national government should be replaced by one as extreme as that which would be led by John Howard, or, heaven forbid, one that might be led by Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen.
Can I put it to you, I hope you don't take too much offence, that you've got a bit in common with Sir Joh. I mean, you're both fairly rough and tumble premiers of mining and cocky states. Neither of you are averse to Canberra bashing when the occasion demands it. You're both populists in your own way. Tempted to follow his lead? Go to Canberra?
There are one or two differences, Andrew, aren't there, in Western Australia and Queensland. We returned 9 of 13 federal members for the Labor Party from Western Australia. And we have a passingly successful Labor government in this state that was returned with a good majority at the last election. I'm not tempted to follow Sir Joh's lead to Canberra. I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to think that in national terms I could make the contribution that is being made by people like the Prime Minister and the Treasurer.
Yes, it's just that, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but some of the backroom people certainly in Canberra would like to see you make the transition, I think particularly since Paul Keating's slight fall from grace.
I've been approached by some people suggesting that I might consider transferring from state to federal politics. I've told them what I've told you this evening. I'm not prepared to entertain the proposition. In personal terms also, I have a big family who for many years have been deprived of my presence as a result of my political commitment. And I do think that in the years to come, I'm going to have to commit myself much more thoroughly to them and their welfare.
Yes, I was in Perth recently and I read your 40th birthday reflections in one of the newspapers there, and you did sound very jaded. I wondered if Canberra mightn't be just the sort of new lease of life you'd be looking for.
Canberra wouldn't be a new lease of life for anyone except the most masochistic of people that I've ever met. You must be joking.
Well, you're on the Pritikin diet. It's excellent training for a Prime Minister, isn't it?
I know, it is good training, not only the Pritikin diet, but on the wagon in respect of alcohol too. But I can't see that going to Canberra would do anything but hasten my demise.
Finally, we have a story coming up in a moment about Rupert Murdoch. Just wondering how you feel about one man controlling 60% of our print media.
Well, it's a bad thing, isn't it? The concentration of media ownership, regardless of whether it's Rupert Murdoch or Robert Holmes à Court or the Fairfax family, must be a bad thing by definition.
Have you told Rob Hawke that?
Well, I've said it publicly on 5 or 6 occasions over here. The problem is, Andrew, that it doesn't come down to a question of the concentration being good or bad. It comes down to a question of whether the concentration's to be in the hands of this person or that person. And so the argument of principle is lost, and the comparison of personality rules the day.
So you're saying they're more concerned about, they've got lost with concerns about whether it's Murdoch or Bond or whatever, rather than the mass ownership question?
Well, absolutely, that's what happens. It's a question of personalities, and it's not a question of ever being able to, unless you intervene in the market, stop the concentration. Although, mind you, when the wash-up is completed on these latest changes, I think that the effects of the federal government's actions will be to reduce the concentration of media ownership, not necessarily print ownership, but of media ownership generally.
Because of the cross-ownership rules?
That's right.
Well, Brian Burke, thank you very much for talking to us this evening.
Thanks for your courtesy, Andrew.
Well, there's another politician who does think that Rupert Murdoch's got too much power, and to prove his point to Four Corners, he cited the Murdoch press's support for yet another politician.
If one went back over 6 months in the Australian, would see headline after headline and editorial repeated many times, supporting Mr. Petersen and building him up as the heartland of the new right. But the picture that the Murdoch press is attributing, or the policies that they're attributing to Bjelke-Petersen, are not the policies that he has ever pursued in practice. So they're building a myth.
But a few weeks is a long time in publishing. The Murdoch press, which now monopolises most of our metropolitan readers, appears to have dumped Sir Joh en masse. Here's a sample of what his papers have been saying about the weekend election results in the top end. The Northern Territory News. Territorians delivered a clear rebuff to Sir Joh's often stated intention of breaking the coalition. The Hobart Mercury. Disciples of the Joh factor have no one to blame but their leader for their push to Canberra failing its first electoral test. The Australian. Sir Joh is an unguided missile liable to do damage to anybody. The Adelaide Advertiser. It would be better for him and for the nation if he withdrew from his wild and disruptive plan. The Brisbane Courier Mail. Sir Joh's efforts might yet lead to only splitting the National Party. The Daily Telegraph. He must be ready to shoulder a significant proportion of the blame should the Labor Party be returned to power. The Melbourne Sun. preferred to make its comment in cartoon form. I don't know whether Sir Joh would appreciate the joke, but he's certainly been round long enough to know that Rupert Murdoch is a man of political whim, switching allegiance to particular politicians or parties as the mood takes him. Now that he controls 60% of our press, his own political power is immense. Yet the Herald and Weekly Times takeover, which would have provoked a storm of protest in any other Western country, happened with scarcely a hint of opposition. Perhaps the most articulate critic of this unprecedented monopoly was, ironically, Rupert Murdoch himself. 10 years ago, he told the world, "If I were to grow bigger and take over one of the other groups in Australia, that would be against the public interest." Well, now that it's happened, what can we expect from the man who rules what we read? Paul Barry has been looking at the history of Rupert Murdoch and the way he runs his newspapers.
When I was very young, I think I was fairly much of a rebel, and I hope very idealistic about everything. I only hope that I haven't lost it all now.
Do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes.
It was on the streets of London, 11,000 miles from Melbourne, that the battle for the Herald and Weekly Times was won. In smashing the power of the British print unions, Rupert Murdoch secured the funds for further conquest. Victory at Wapping trebled the group's share price, settled any doubts of his Wall Street bankers, and guaranteed for News Corporation an extra $120 million profit every year. At Wapping, Murdoch used Australian trucks to crush a British strike to pay for expansion in America and beyond. Here was the global businessman in action. Rupert Murdoch is the most powerful media baron the world has ever seen. From film and television in Hollywood, to newspapers in New York and London, to printers, publishers, paper mills, his fiefdom spans 3 continents. It bestrides the New World and the Old. And now, back in the land of his birth, here in Australia, he dominates the press to a degree unknown anywhere else in the West. With the Herald and Weekly Times now back in the family, 60% of Australia's newspapers will now speak with Rupert Murdoch's voice. And politicians of all parties have stood back and allowed it to happen.
Do you think the politicians are frightened of him?
I'm certain of it.
Why do you say that?
The very fact that only 2 politicians have voiced any criticism, Bill Hayden and Ian McPhee.
I can't understand how every Labor man, with the exception really of Hayden, who made a few noises, can have swallowed all of the opinions that they've held in the past about dominance of the media by one person, and especially about Murdoch.
It gives one corporation or one person far too much power and influence over the selection of news, the presentation of news, and also the presentation of opinion, and that, I think, is dangerous.
When Rupert Murdoch walked into the inherited family business 34 years ago, few thought he would even make a go of it. His father in particular, who had built up the Melbourne Herald Group, had great doubts about his abilities. But how wrong they were. On the base of the tiny Adelaide News and a share stake worth £70,000, Rupert Murdoch has built an empire worth $6 billion. On the way, he has turned losing newspapers into winners, he has taken risks that others wouldn't touch, and he has found critics wherever he has turned.
He's an extremely good businessman who has built a very big empire very quickly. He's a ruthless man. He's much more interested in the success of newspapers than he is in their quality.
In newspapers, the popular dictum is, you never go bust by underestimating the public taste. To judge by his titles, Rupert Murdoch has lived by it. Whether in Sydney on the Daily Mirror, in America on the New York Post, or in London on the Sun, the Murdoch recipe for increasing sales is pretty much the same, and it works. The Sun, with its generous helpings of naked women, was bought by Murdoch for just £500,000. It now makes maybe 100 times that every year in profit.
I think he's a great debaser of every medium that he gets his hands on. He's the original tits and bum merchant. The page 3 with the woman spilling out of her bra, that's one of his trademarks.
I'm not ashamed of any of my newspapers at all. And I'm rather sick of snobs who tell us that they're bad papers, snobs who only read papers that no one else wants. I doubt if they read many papers at all. And whereas on most issues they consider themselves liberals or radicals or something, they think they ought to be imposing their taste on everybody else in the community.
Hostage-taking is made to appear a profitable
I think that's right. Not all the Murdoch papers are cast in the same image of bare breasts and banner heads. The Australian is sober and upstanding by anybody's standards. High-tech, low staff, it shares stories with other Murdoch papers to keep down costs. In some ways, its history shows Rupert Murdoch at his best. He created the paper, he took the risks, he stuck with the losses over 20 years. But it also shows the other side of Murdoch, meddling in politics, provoking his journalists to revolt, interfering with and sacking editors. The origins of the paper, back in 1964, are part of the Murdoch legend. Here was a proprietor who was one of the boys, who could do everyone's job. From the start, he inspired great loyalty, but also unease.
In the first 4 or 5 months, probably I think up until the time I left the Australian, Rupert would quite often be seen down on the stone making up the paper. Now, this bloke's running an organisation of ex-papers and millions of pounds turnover. There he is, bits of lead, making up the paper. It's very unnerving.
Max Newton, the Australian's founding editor, arrived with a first in economics and a reputation as a whiz kid. A year later, he left, nursing a thick ear and somewhat bemused.
He's a very tough proprietor who, I think, in the course of the period we're at the Australian, sacked more journalists than I think I'd ever seen sacked before in my whole career. He's a tremendous sacker, but of course he's also a tremendous hirer. So he's always sacking them and hiring them.
Newton's parting comment as he left the Australian was that Murdoch and independent editors didn't mix. It's a refrain that has echoed down the years.
The harder financial facts of defence and all that goes into it.
On the Australian, as on other Murdoch papers, being editor has not been the most secure of jobs. And in all parts of the world, crossing Rupert has been reckoned a shortcut to unemployment.
Well, front perhaps, or on page 3. Yes. Now, by the time people pull it out and turn it around, they've got to do all those things before they realise it's not an ad. I think just because I haven't got on with or managed to get the right working relationship with every single editor that I've appointed would for a minute suggest that I'm ruthless.
Thanks. Right, Denis, how did the foreign pages finish up?
Looking at the Australian today, it's hard to believe the tales of old still apply.
Well, there's just a lot of speculation there.
After all, Editor-in-Chief Les Hollings has been around for a dozen years without being sacked once. Surely, nowadays, Rupert doesn't rampage into town to throw his weight around. Surely, with a global empire to run, he doesn't have the time to interfere at all.
Of course Mr. Murdoch hasn't got time to intervene, but Mr. Murdoch chooses his people carefully, and his people know that unless they please him, they go out.
If you were an editor or a leader writer who disagreed with Rupert Murdoch, would you last long?
No, you wouldn't. In fact, you'd naturally bow out.
The truth is, almost all proprietors like to see their views in print. So is Murdoch any worse than his rivals? Like, for example, Fairfax.
Fairfax, in my view, have maintained not a bad balance as newspaper proprietors go.
But they have influenced what their papers have said, or they have ordered their papers to say things. They have backed politicians.
Yes, this is true, but I don't think their record compares with the record of their rivals.
Like Murdoch?
like Murdoch.
Which is worse?
In particular, far worse.
You can argue that a proprietor has every right to tell his editors what to do and every right to make the policy of his newspapers. But Rupert Murdoch doesn't just have one newspaper or even a handful of newspapers. He controls 3 out of 5 of Australia's dailies. And he doesn't just make his policies. He has in the past thrown his newspapers into political crusades.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are now, as I say, I believe, at a moment of destiny, and it gives me an unqualified pleasure now to introduce to you the man who is going to be the first Labor Prime Minister of Australia for 23 years, Gough Whitlam.
Even in the early days, Murdoch plunged his papers into politics. But in the 1972 election campaign, he went overboard for Whitlam. No proprietor has ever so involved himself in a campaign. In backing Whitlam to the hilt, Murdoch's papers gave free advertising and money to the Labour Party, and they backed a winner. But 3 years after Whitlam's victory, Murdoch swung his papers into violent opposition. Whitlam said it was because he had refused to grant political favours that Murdoch had asked for. Those close to Murdoch deny it and say he wanted a piece of the action, to be close to the throne, and Whitlam denied him access. But however it was, Murdoch decreed Whitlam should be dumped.
During 1974, when he'd been in Britain for some time, buying his empire there, he came to the conclusion that Wilson's socialism was ruining Britain. He looked at Australia and came to the conclusion that Whitlam's socialism was ruining Australia. And he decided quite clearly that he was going to get rid of Whitlam. He also judged, I think, that the Whitlam government had gone astray and was going to get beaten at the next polls anyway. In any case, the instruction came out in the early days of 75, hit Whitlam.
How did that instruction come?
Not directly to me, but I was leader writing, and the instructions relayed by the editor were, Rupert wants us to go balls and all for Whitlam, and none of this essay stuff that we were doing then.
The Murdoch papers were in fact the last to turn against Whitlam, but when they did so, they were the most strident. The Australian's front pages in October 1975 led the campaign to get Whitlam out.
The proclamation which you have just heard read by the Governor-General's official secretary was countersigned Malcolm Fraser.
On November the 11th, the Governor-General dismissed the government. The rest is history. In the subsequent election campaign, the Murdoch papers once more went hammer and tongs against Labour.
But what happened was that his underlings, or his lieutenants, interpreted that get Whitlam in a far wider way than I think even he meant. And it became a matter of the news columns were turned over to getting Whitlam as well as the editorial column. And I mean that in the sense of the news was not used favourable to Whitlam, all news unfavourable to Whitlam, and the government, of course, was used. The sin of omission, of distortion of news by omission. Now, the very first point of the Journalist Code of Ethics says that is what we must not do.
So you're saying that news columns were slanted against Whitlam and in favour of the Liberals?
Yes.
In the early days of the campaign, the Daily Mirror ran a story with banner heads. Gough's promise, cheap rents. By the next edition, it was shouting, Gough panics, cheap rents. The copy, too, had been changed to be anti-Labour. Some days later, the supposedly scrupulous Australian reported, unemployment up by nearly 20,000. On the same day, all other papers, faced with the same figures, had reached the opposite conclusion. The Labour Party had no doubt it was deliberate.
But what did Mr. Murdoch do? Right across the front page of the same day's Australian. Unemployment up!
Well, he threw in the weight of all of his media outlets in Australia in a quite hysterical campaign, as though the fate of Australia depended on getting rid of Whitlam, the man whom he'd supported in 1972. It wasn't a measured analysis of what the Whitlam government had done. It was quite a hysterical campaign. So this man was some sort of a demon that you had to get rid of if the country wasn't to sink into the ocean.
How much was that Rupert Murdoch's personal campaign, and how much was
I've
it
got
from
no
his
doubt
editors?
it was Rupert Murdoch's personal campaign.
Enraged by what they saw as blatant political bias, 600 trade unionists and students mobbed the Murdoch building in Sydney, burning papers and disrupting delivery trucks. But more was to come. On December the 9th, Murdoch's journalists struck in protest, saying we cannot be loyal to a propaganda sheet. It was the first time in Australian history that journalists had gone on strike for such a reason. Malcolm Fraser was so pleased with the way Murdoch's papers covered the 1975 campaign that he tried to recruit the editor of The Australian to write his speeches. Today, he says, giving Murdoch 60% of Australia's dailies is dangerous and undesirable.
Well, I think we all know he supported Mr. Whitlam in '72 very vigorously. He supported me very vigorously in 1975. He supported me again in '77. I think he was neutral in 1980, and he supported Mr. Hawke in 1983. Now, all right, he's gone around the political spectrum, but much more obviously so than any other of the newspapers who would have presumably preserved a more even path, not being so vigorous in support of anyone at any point, and maybe not so vigorous in opposition either. And again, when the Murdoch chain only had a much smaller part of the total Australian circulation, the consequences of his own campaigns would be much less evident, much less important, because they're counterbalanced by other views. But now they won't be counterbalanced by other views. And, I mean, look, in the industrial market, we say it's wrong for any one firm to dominate the market or to act in ways that reduce competition, because that's bad for the consumer. I think it's infinitely more important in a democratic society, in the media, because competition, diversity, clash of ideas is an inherent and vital part of a democracy.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you give a big, warm welcome to the Premier of South Australia, Des Corcoran.
In 1979, in the South Australian state elections, Murdoch's papers were at it again. This time, the Press Council was to back up allegations of bias made by the State Labor Party, who complained that the Murdoch-owned Adelaide News reported the campaign unfairly. The News, Labor said, had twisted stories to make Labor look bad and gave front-page treatment to items favourable to the Liberals.
This headline in the News from the very first day of the campaign started the trend. What they did is put a headline on as though Tonkin had some secret plan because he had nothing to say. We waited for all the rest of the campaign and Tonkin's secret plan never emerged. It was just to give Tonkin a favourable headline.
The Liberal candidate for Premier, David Tonkin, was reckoned at the start of the campaign to be lacklustre and a certain loser. But he won.
Our campaign hasn't really started yet, but it will start, and it'll start with great impact.
And some people in the Labor Party had no doubt as to why.
The amount of assistance that's been given to him by the bias of the newspaper is just been unbelievable in this state. And I say to the other people in Australia that the power of the press in this country that belongs to a very few families is frightening.
The Labor Party analysed the News's coverage and found 71% of the prime news space was pro-Liberal in the campaign. And of 17 front pages, only one had said anything positive about Labor.
Well, it was appalling. It was every honest independent observer said it was totally biased. In fact, we complained to the Australian Press Council, and the Australian Press Council overwhelmingly found in our favour, declared that the News was biased against the Labor Party.
The Press Council said the news coverage was intensely partisan, and it found Murdoch's paper guilty on 2 specific charges of distortion or unfair reporting. If the Labor victory was blunted by the Press Council's view that being partisan might not be a crime, Labor at least felt entirely vindicated.
The performance of News Limited in this campaign was a very sick performance, and it was something which a lot of Australians have got to think about. I really do sound a word of warning to the voters of Australia that we live with a very sick situation with the ownership of the media in Australia. We should demonopolise it if we possibly can.
That was Labour politician Mick Young talking 8 years ago. Now he's a member of the cabinet. He and his colleagues were noticeably quiet about the Herald and Weekly Times takeover, even though it gives Rupert Murdoch far more power than ever he had in 1979. I asked Mick Young for his views on the takeover in the light of what he said 8 years ago, but he declined to comment. Strangely, in view of Labour's unhappy history with Murdoch and past statements that the press barons have too much power, only one Labour politician did speak up against the takeover, Bill Hayden.
I wouldn't like to see anyone have the level of media ownership and concentration that Mr. Murdoch appears to be about to establish. And in particular, I don't care to see Mr. Murdoch because of his record in the past of using his media outlets, most notably his newspapers, to promote views which defend his self-interest and to do that in a way which I think undermines the whole credibility of journalism and its claim to be objective and to pursue issues on the basis of objective facts.
The Hawke government's hands-off approach has been explained by saying that the new cross-media rules will in the long run reduce monopoly, at least by forcing the likes of Murdoch to choose between newspapers and TV. It's also been suggested that the government lacked the power to intervene. But could it be simply that they lacked the nerve?
Let me stress that under Labor's new system of media control, there will be total freedom of the press. Rupert said that, did he? Well, my mistake. There will be total partial freedom of the... Bondi said that, did he? Well, there will be a certain amount of total partial freedom of... Cordy said that, eh? Well, there may be a certain limited amount of not quite as total as we might have previously thought partial freedom of the press, within limits. Bill Hayden said that, eh? Tell him to get stuck with it.
The press have said quite plainly that they expect a commitment to have been given from the corporation to support the government in the next elections. I would believe that to be correct.
As I've said before about this sort of deal that Labor seems to make with big business these days, that when Labor jumps into bed with big business, it shouldn't mistake a one-night stand for eternal love.
How do you know there was a deal?
I don't know. I see it as a matter of irresistible inference. I think that there had to be a deal, something like that.
Do you think politicians are wary or frightened of Rupert Murdoch?
Yes, I do.
So far as the opposition is concerned, I have some direct information that a number of members of the opposition have been fearful of speaking out on this particular question. And I'm sure that would apply across the political spectrum. It's not just the opposition.
Malcolm Fraser in the past was never so outspoken about the Murdoch power. But as Prime Minister for 8 years, he should have first-hand knowledge. Indeed, in 1981, Fraser himself was accused of pandering to Murdoch's needs. In late 1979, Murdoch's news group had bought a half share in Ansett Airlines. Ansett's planes weren't the reason for his interest, so much as the TV station that Ansett owned in Melbourne, Channel 10. Murdoch already owned the 10 station in Sydney, and the two together offered him the most powerful block in the network. But that very power worried the smaller stations and the regulatory authorities, who decided to refuse him the licence. In September 1980, the Australian Broadcasting Tribunal said Murdoch could not have the Melbourne Channel 10. It was against the public interest. Murdoch, they said, had broken the law by not getting prior approval, and what's more, he wasn't a resident of Australia, which the law required him to be. The Fraser government's response was to change the law, and they made no bones about the fact that they wanted to get Murdoch off the hook. And in case there was any doubt, when the original tribunal decision came on appeal to the federal court, the government made it quite clear that the proceedings were irrelevant. If Murdoch lost again, they said, he could simply reapply under the new law, and that would let him through. During that court appeal, Murdoch was asked whether he or his executives had discussed the new law with the government. His answer on oath was a definite no. It was therefore a surprise to learn later that Malcolm Fraser had discussed the bill at some length with an old friend of his, Richard Searby. Surprising because Searby was a director of News Limited. The explanation, both sides said, was that Searby was acting in a purely private capacity. But Ian Sinclair, the communications minister, had a different version. He had also met Richard Searby and other News Limited executives to chew over the bill, and he was adamant they had been acting for Murdoch's company. It was all most embarrassing.
It was a great row when you did change the law in 1981.
I didn't
Suggestions
feel it
that
as
you were getting him off the hook and that you yourself had succumbed to pressure. I mean, is there nothing in that?
No, there isn't, because I don't, you know, I really did believe that the fact that he was a foreign resident but an Australian should not be held against him. I'd have quite a different view now that he has forsworn Australian nationality and taken out American citizenship. But the fact that they tried to kick up a fuss, and the fact that nobody has said anything at all now, in an infinitely more serious situation, in a way that has reduced competition enormously in the print media, I think says something very significant and tragic and serious.
We know where he is! We know where he is! If you're looking for Rupert Murdoch, we know where.
On the other side of the world, in the ranks of the British print unions, Rupert Murdoch is not a popular man. But the printers have even fewer friends. Despite a year-long battle on the streets, the British public showed neither sympathy for the strikers nor anger at Murdoch. And while the unions officially blacked his papers, truck drivers and journalists worked on regardless. By forcing new technology through Fleet Street, Murdoch may have done Britain a favour. But even Murdoch's admirers wouldn't want him to have such power over the press as he now has in Australia.
I don't think anybody ought to have 60% stake in the newspapers of any country, however good they are. And I certainly don't think, therefore, it's desirable for him to have 60% of the Australian press.
Sir William Rees-Mogg was editor of The Times in 1981 when Rupert Murdoch took it over. He describes himself as a Murdoch supporter, but with friends like this, Murdoch hardly needs enemies.
I actually like him. I always sound as if, because I try to face the facts, I regard him as a man with very many good qualities and very striking bad qualities. Very interesting, exciting person, entertaining to meet. He's always been perfectly friendly and okay with me. Basically, I think he's got too much power.
Is he trustworthy?
Difficult to say. He's trustworthy in certain ways and not in other ways. He's very cunning.
Harry Evans, the next editor of The Times, was less complimentary. Murdoch, he said, used his newspapers for personal gain, and he backed politicians purely for the power and patronage they gave. In 1981, Mrs. Thatcher in particular was persuaded that Murdoch should be allowed to take over The Times and Sunday Times without the matter being referred to the Monopolies Commission. Murdoch, in return, gave guarantees to Parliament and to his journalists that his editors would be free from any interference. "If I even talk to you," he joked to Harry Evans, "I shall be put in jail." Within a year, Evans had been sacked. The guarantees, said Evans, had been torn up. And Murdoch remarked, "All over the world I give instructions to my editors. Why shouldn't I in London?" 6 years after the takeover, now ensconced in Fortress Wapping, The Times and Sunday Times are making money and sales are rising. Both papers are now firmly pro-Thatcher. Not surprising, since the government's union laws helped make the Wapping victory possible. In Britain, Murdoch's market share is roughly 30%. But already here, many people believe he has too much power. And the idea of him having double that, as he now does in Australia, fills them with some alarm.
I think it's very, very bad indeed for all the democratic values which we think we hold dear. The fact that he is the owner of so many newspapers means that politicians regard him as an immensely powerful figure. And if you think that the power of the media counts, television or newspapers, it must be bad. It's all in one man's hands.
Well, I think any country is sensible to have a law which says that not more than a certain percentage of its press can be owned by one man. Otherwise, you have a monopoly. It's not good business. It's against the whole principle of free enterprise. And it's certainly not good in terms of communications and opinion.
You can't control a newspaper proprietor or a newspaper editor from the outside, other than by laws which we would all regard as grossly oppressive. Those in this country who are talking about nationalising the press, which the extreme left does, I mean, conjure up an East European image of absolute horror. The only way control can be exerted is by limiting the amount of ownership, whether of television or of newspapers.
What sort of percentage would be a reasonable one, then?
I don't know. I would think there ought to be at least 4 separate. That means 25–30% ought to be the limit for any one of them.
In Australia, there is no such law. It's even been suggested the government has no power under the Constitution to pass one. But the government does regulate corporations and monopolies, and there seems no reason why it should not regulate the press. And in practice, the powers already existed to prevent the Herald and Weekly Times takeover, because Rupert Murdoch is a foreign citizen. That, at least, is the verdict of former Supreme Court Judge Hal Wooten, who was chairman of the Press Council until he resigned in protest at the takeover.
Or had the government wished to stop it, it could have done so very easily. Under the Foreign Takeovers Act, the takeover could not go ahead if the Treasurer declared that it was against the public interest. The guidelines themselves said that there would not ordinarily be given approval to foreign investment in mass circulation newspapers, yet he was allowed to take over this enormous part of the press.
Why? Why did it happen?
Governments are simply frightened of big media proprietors. They fawn upon them. They hope for their support in the next election. And at least if they haven't got their support, they don't want to make enemies of them.
Very simply, we have a situation where one man now owns 60% of Australia's newspapers. Should that be reversed?
Oh, yes, undoubtedly it should be reversed. But the very fact that he has that power, of course, makes him nearly invulnerable to government action. It's going to be an extraordinarily courageous government that has him on.
The last word on it all should be left to Rupert Murdoch. 20 years ago, he was asked by the ABC about the power of press barons like himself. It could be, he said, a force for evil. And, he continued,
I think the important thing is that there'll be plenty of newspapers with plenty of different people controlling them, so that there's a variety of viewpoint, that there's a choice for the public. This is the freedom of the press that is needed. Freedom of the press mustn't be one-sided just for a publisher to speak as he pleases, try and bully the community.
Well, he can afford to change his mind, I guess. There aren't too many people left who'll draw our attention to it when he does. Our reporter was Paul Barry. And now for some light relief. We're crossing to Melbourne and the International Comedy Festival. The show got underway an hour or so ago under the patronage of Sir Les Patterson, with English funny man Peter Cook the star turn. Local comics like Max Gillies, Wendy Harmer and Jerry Connolly are also on the bill, but most attention at tonight's opening concert centres on the remarkable Joh Bjelke-Petersen. Some politicians might have ducked for cover after the weekend drubbing he received, but not the redoubtable Premier of Queensland. Well, Sir Joh, I'm just wondering what you're doing at a comedy festival.
Well, Mr. Ollie, you can hear the people in the background calling Joh for PM. That is the policy and that is the strong positive attitude that I have adopted now for 18 years going right through. And I told you last year when you were giving me an interview that I wouldn't come on your program unless you adopted a positive attitude. It is simple and as sure as I've told and indicated to you people right through at the ABC. You just don't know which foot of the side of the bread your bed is buttered on.
Sir Joh, look, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but
yes.
It is a comedy festival. Are you getting many laughs?
Well, I've always got many, many laughs, whether I try to or not. But the difficult thing is, of course, that people like yourself are always giving me ammunition because you've got egg on your face from the last election and you'll have egg on your face when I go on and develop my three-pronged plan. Well, you all people can laugh too. But, well, I'll tell you this much, that the first part, of course, of my plan was to go and set the cat among the pigeons with Howard and Sinclair because yesterday's feather duster is tomorrow's chook. It's as simple as that. And the second policy, of course, like every good Lutheran, I went over to Tokyo and nailed my 98 theses on a Japanese temple. And to tell you people the policies that we will be adopting or will not be adopting as the case may be.
So, Joe, you're getting plenty of reaction from the audience there now. You don't mind people laughing at you?
Yeah, well, you're very, very funny too, Mr. Ollie, and I've told you now. You just, yes, well, just you wait, because you've got your job to do and I've got mine. You continue with that attitude. When I'm Prime Minister, you won't even have a job.
Well,
well, you can stay there on your 4 or 5 corners or whatever the program is. Because I wouldn't talk to Jane Singleton in Queensland for 3 years, and she had to go down to the southern socialist capital of Sydney. Yeah, well, there's more to it than meets the eye, that's for sure.
Well, Sir Joe, indeed. In fact, it's the first interview you've granted me or Four Corners for some time, and we're really grateful. But does this mean that all is forgiven?
No, it certainly does not mean that all is forgiven. Florence will be cleaning up Canberra. I'll be cleaning up the ABC. Florence will be getting rid of the women who don't want to be the women who want to be women who don't want to want to be women. Doing wheeze and number 2s outside Parliament House. Goodness gracious me, I don't... What would the Queen think of that?
Look, that's a question I can't possibly answer at this moment, Sir Joe, but look, I understand. I better let you go. I gather there are some people you want to meet.
Yes, this is the third prong of our prong, and that is to get some joke candidates, and we'll go and meet them now.
Thank you very much, Sir Joe.
Oh, yes, I was wondering if you'd be able to help me out.
Come here, it's a big banana himself. Oi!
Oi, and he's packed his lunch.
How you, sweetheart, eh?
Oh, you spunky.
Gee whiz, I'm sorry, I thought I was told there'd be talent here.
Talent? There might be snow on the roof, but there's fire in the furnace, baby. Did you bring your friend Jerry Mandy?
Hey, we could have a foursome if you...
Come on,
Oh, goodness gracious me, I have never seen anything like it. This is typical of the way they...
Oh, it's fun to be
Good evening. This is a door knock appeal for the joke candidates.
Joh Bjelke-Petersen,
Mr. Butler, how are you?
Joe, I'm very well,
Sorry,
thanks,
Rod, I
Joe.
don't want him in here.
No, look, it's all right, Mark.
No,
Listen,
Rod, I don't want him in here.
Joe, I'm president of the
Please go,
Comedians
Joe.
for Joe campaign.
Oh, yes, we need all the
Very
support.
funny.
Get out of it,
Fail to
Mark.
see the humour in that.
And we think you'll
Please
do a
go,
lot.
please go,
Mark,
Joe.
no, Mark,
No,
leave him... Look, Mark,
I'm sorry, Rod, sorry,
Now,
Rod,
listen,
I failed
Mark,
to see
I'm
the humour.
telling you...
Yeah, well, don't call us, you call me.
These are really important.
Oh, John, how are you going? What are you doing the next 6 months? I'm looking for a candidate.
Well, Mr. Premier, I'm afraid you've left your run a bit late, son.
Why is that?
Well, I'm announcing my candidacy for the Prime Ministership tonight.
Oh, gee whiz, who's backing you?
Oh, well, I got a few of the banks behind me. They reckon I've got enough money to take over BHP any time I like. Who's backing you?
Oh, well, we won't go into that. Do you care to make a donation?
Well, we won't go into that either, son.
Oh, well, best of luck, and may the one who wins form a coalition.
Okay, good luck in the Northern Territory.
Ah, yes, Mr. Connolly, yes, that's the one I want to see. He used to be from Queensland. Ah, Mr. Connolly, yes, there you are. Right, so Joe, didn't realise you were on the bill as well. Oh. Yes, of course, I am announcing my policy, my 3-pronged plan for world domination. And where else to do it but better, of course, in the comedy festival. I'm due on stage in a moment, so... well, I don't care what you do, because it's about time you adopted a positive attitude in regard to the things that you're doing, trying to make a clever living out of people by doing people in this way and that way. If you don't adopt a positive attitude, you will be laughing on the other foot at the side of the fence, cutting off your face beside your nose. Your face is good for. What can I do now?
You've got to laugh. Our guide on that little backstage tour was, of course, Jerry Connolly. Next week, Four Corners will be coming to you from the Hurstville Civic Centre in Sydney. It's a one-night stand with not too many laughs. The subject is AIDS, which already looks like claiming at least 30,000 Australian lives. Yes, 30,000. AIDS concerns all of us. And in next week's program, we'll be giving the floor to everyone from public servants to prostitutes. It's a program you can't afford to miss. Good night.